first two nights, we have looked over the commandments that deal with our relationship with God. Right? We don't swear, we don't make graven images, we don't take the name of His in vain. There's four of them. Now we're on the fifth and sixth. They're interesting ones. Because what happens from now on is we deal with our relationship with each other as God would have it. And so today we deal with honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. And thou shalt do no murder. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that your God gave you. And thou shalt not do murder. The one dealing with parents is an interesting one in many ways, in that when we read that, what the first thing we think of is that I'm supposed to respect my parents, right? I will obey them. And all that's true. But it has something to do with how we treat them when we get old. In another 30 or 40 years, Erica and Mike and Father Peter and, the other kids I have are going to have to deal with an old man. And how are they going to treat me? Nursing home. Yeah, I heard that. And the whole thing has to do with the value of life. I tend to make a lot of hospital calls for a variety of reasons, both good and bad. I try to visit people if they're in the hospital every day. So I average about 10 hours a week in hospital calls. Considering it's been 45 years, starting with seminary and the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, that's a lot of hours. And I've learned so much about people. When I got to St. Bartholomew's, there was a woman by the name of Nancy. And Nancy had MS. She got it at the very end of when you're supposed to get MS, It's kind of like, would have lasted another month or two, she would have been too old statistically, but she got it. And I came there, and her house was up the street from the church. And only once did I see her out of bed. Only once. In about 20 years. And her husband took an early retirement. He made all the meals. He cleaned her. He fed her. He took care of her. That was his life. And she was sick, unable to walk. And I remember once she went in the hospital, and she was on a floor with one of my parishioners who was a nurse. And the nurse, being much into the medical model, when I mentioned something about Nancy, she looked at her friend and said, "If I get that, I know what pills I'm going to take. I'm out of here." And I looked at her and I said, she doesn't have the life she wants. But for the last 20-some years, she's raised her son. She saw him graduate. This is the youngest son. She saw him go in the Marines. She saw him get out of the Marines. She saw him get married. She watched her grandchildren baptized in her living room, because that's where I baptized them. God had a purpose for her. And for her husband, because he died a few months after she did. When it says, honor thy father and mother, it is talking to us not just about respecting your parents, because we know that sometimes you don't, right? Sometimes you're smart mouth, or whatever you refer to it as in your parent house. Sometimes you disrespect them. just like they disrespected their parents. And that's why one of the reasons we go to confession. And that's why one of the reasons when we leave here, we go back and we look at them and say, you know, last week before I went to St. Mike's, I was a twit. I do love you. I do love you. And they will hug you and probably give you something to eat. But this is talking far beyond that. You see, in the cultures of that time, there was a real simple rule. It was that as long as you could produce, you could live. When you failed to produce, you were expected to die. And so all the cultures around the Promised Land had euthanasia. Gramps got too old to work. Gramps ate more than he produced. You'd say, Gramps, there's the desert. Why don't you go for a walk? Why don't you go for a walk? And it wasn't just there. We all admire the Eskimo culture. You don't go real far for a walk in the snow. But they would say, go to the ice floe. You're consuming too much. And so when the people of Israel went into the Promised Land, the first, dealing with other people, what did he say? Every life is of value. Every life is of value. And we don't take it away. You are responsible, Yahweh said to the people of Israel, for those who are old and infirmed. If they can't work, you work. You care for them. And then we come to the next one. Thou shalt do no murder. Thou shalt do no murder. Historically, it doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not do murder. There's a difference, isn't there? Murder is taking an innocent life. Sometimes you have to kill. Sometimes you have to kill. But we still know that life is sacred. 3 of the policemen I've dealt with in one department in the last 5 years, almost 26, have had to draw their weapon and kill somebody because other people were in danger. I remember going to a house where a man shot at the police officers, and they did everything they could to take him alive, and they didn't know where he was. When they opened the door, he was right there, and he pulled a shotgun and fired it. And 2 of the 3 drew their weapon. The other had trouble because he got powder burns all in this area, but the other 2 drew their weapons and killed him. And I went into the house with the mother later, and it was still icky boo. And the mother looked at me and said, I knew he had problems. I just prayed that no one else would be hurt. Those men took a life, but it was to protect lives. That's not murder. 3 weeks ago, I had a call, some of you read this, from a police officer I've known many years. His mother was one of my parishioners. And so I visited her when she was sick and when she had to move to Cincinnati because her children cared for her. I tried to go down there 4 or 5 times a year and give her communion. And he called me up on a Sunday night in tears. And he said that his partner had been murdered. And it was murder. The man called 911 and said there was a man with a gun. And so this cop pulled up. Didn't see a man with a gun. And the man who called up had the gun. Shot him in both arms. The guy was a martial artist, so he went after him with his feet. And then he was killed. That's murder when you take an innocent life. It's murder. He had several small children. God tells us that we cannot murder. Each of us has to decide, as Anglicans, whether or not, if necessary, we kill. You have a right as Anglicans to be a conscientious objector. In other words, I will not kill under any circumstances. That is a legitimate position of Anglicanism. Some of us couldn't do that. If someone came into my house and threatened my family, there'd be no issue. And yet I have to tell you, every man I've known who has taken a life is never the same. Whether it's the 3 cops in that department who have had to take lives, or soldiers I've worked with who had to take lives, they're never really the same. Because life is sacred. They had no option, but deep down inside, we know that God gives life, and that it is important and sacred and should not be taken away. Now, our culture is changing. Europe is changing because it is no longer Christian. I'm not sure we're a Christian country. And therefore, we have lost some respect for life. There are places in Europe where old people do not want to go to the hospital. I never want to go to the hospital, but they don't want to go to the hospital because they're not sure if they'll be given an overdose. Because they are no longer producing. They're consuming more than they produce. Now, remember the line I haven't said anything about? That your days may be long in the land of your God. You know, when I sloughed over that for 30 or 40 years, I always thought it was that their lives would be long. Your grandparents, your parents. No, it says our lives. Our lives. What does that mean? It means that if you are given a country by God, you follow His rules. You do not take innocent lives, whether they're babies in a womb or grandparents who can't feed themselves. Because life is sacred. And once you start going down that slippery slope of taking a life for this reason or that reason, you no longer have a country which is blessed by God. You and I need, on a regular basis, to pray for life. Children in the womb, old people. To pray for our country, that it understands that if we fail to obey God, we will lose His favor.